Dr. Hofstadter, I understand
You can do a pledge? I don't know if we do that on a work session.
We don't do that.
Okay, that's right.
You got a point of order, though.
A point of personal privilege that Waynesboro and Augusta County have been green. So as promised, my mask is going to disappear today. Stay tuned. If it reappears, you know what my news will be. But that is good news for all of us. So hopefully we will stay in the green zone, but let's stay tuned. All right. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
It is great to see your smiling face.
I've been scowling for months, so now you know.
All right, Mike, we're
You
turning it
ready?
over to you.
All right, thank you, Mr. Mayor.
This is your moment.
Well, I was going to share something along those lines that it's always exciting, I think, to present the spending plan for the year, but it's also, I also carry apprehension about not so much the content, because I have a lot of confidence in this staff and the folks that we've worked with previously, but apprehension about have we made the right judgments in the presentation, what to emphasize, how much detail to go into, what is the right pace to present a 300-page document to a council who has about a month and a half or 2 months to make important decisions. So I'm always a little excited about the opportunity, but apprehensive about the job that we do in that regard. This year, I'd like to the extent possible, create a less formal, less Mike and staff presenting environment, and more encourage the council to stop and seek clarification, ask questions along the way. If the spirit moves you to applause, so be it. Similarly, if the spirit moves you to boo and hiss, we welcome all feedback. I think that's going to be an important piece of every budget process, is to let us know where we've gotten it right and where we're squared away, but where you might need additional clarification or where we need to pursue correction in terms of your preferences. We do have additional time built into the schedule. We talked about the fact that you're getting the budget presentation about 2 weeks earlier than you normally would, and then we've built in some work sessions between the presentation and the time at which the council needs to confirm decisions around rates. So that work has expanded opportunity, more time. You should feel less stressed, less compressed to make those decisions. The general fund balances at $57.2 million. That's about a 5% increase over the current fiscal year, and I think that's indicative of some healthy activity that is fairly visible in the community in terms of residential development and commercial development. It's a curious time because I think there are obviously positive evidence of healthy economic activity, and we see that in revenue receipts, and we see that physically in the community. But we also recognize that there are forces out there with kind of a screwy labor market, building inflation, rising fuel costs, that make it difficult to make absolute statements about the economic environment in which we've developed this budget. I would say, though, generally, we view the positive forces, at least at this time, to be carrying the day. We've made assumptions with the revenues to reflect that. In terms of, excuse me, noteworthy expenditure items in the general fund, we include a mid-year implementation of the first phase of the comp study and a mid-year 3% merit opportunity that's available for both full-time and part-time employees. We talked during the year this year about the fact that our organization has not had a consistent habit with respect to part-time employees, and that we needed to be more intentional and more thoughtful about including them in the raise opportunity. And so we've done that this year, and I think that's an important improvement. We increased support for Waynesboro Public Schools in the amount of $770,000. I think that is indicative of health in the economy, and also reflects the funding formula, the mutually agreed upon funding formula. So that is, I think, I would say a couple things. One, it's good and healthy to be able to furnish that additional revenue. I think it reflects the council's ongoing support for public education, and I think that's a good thing, and I appreciate the fact that the funding formula has been a stabilizing influence on the work that we do with the school system. We have included in the budget in the amount of about $205,000 the mid-year increases that you just furnished to EOC and fire. Obviously, we amend our current year budget, but that carries into the next budget, and we felt like that was important to identify discreetly as an increase in the budget. And we also have appreciable increases in the retirement assessment for the Virginia retirement system. We're covering an anticipated increase in health insurance, and we have funds to support the additional holidays that the council approved. Those things collectively, with the compensation increases, I think improve our position with respect to employee compensation and competing in an ever increasingly competitive labor market. I think in terms of how we support those recommendations and all of the recommendations in the general fund, it's worth noting that we are not recommending, or I am not recommending, increases in taxes, fees, or licenses in the general fund. There is one caveat that we'll come back to periodically and explain, and we've alluded to this in previous presentations. We're seeing some unusual activity in used motor vehicle values, and that will create a need to give some special consideration to that revenue and possible outcomes with those rising values. We plan to have the Commissioner of the Revenue speak Monday at our regular meeting, and then we'll give some additional treatment to that very generally today, but we probably need to dedicate a portion of the April 5th work session to getting into the details and what it means for decisions related to council. I'll note that the current budget, as it's recommended and presented, does not include any additional revenue from the exceptional market behavior. So we've forecasted those revenues the way that we normally would, and it does not include additional revenue resulting from those exceptionally high used vehicle values at this time. And we'll work with council to kind of confirm that decision or make a different decision. The guiding factors, we've talked about this before. These are slightly different from priorities, but they're assumptions that we make as a staff regarding how we perceive the council views the budget process and the state of the community and municipal services. We obviously agree that there's an exceptional quality of life that we enjoy in Waynesboro, and we take care not to disturb it through intentionally decreasing services or programs. And we want to draw attention to any measures in the budget that we think improve quality of life. And we have a significant one of those this year. But beyond that, we're working to preserve, and we don't think we do, we certainly don't reduce or threaten quality of life. But we're not, outside of one capital improvement project, we're not pushing new programs or new services that particularly enhance quality of life. Service levels are maintained at their current state. You will from time to time, and we've talked about this a little bit, hear perhaps in the community that service is delayed or that there's an interruption of some sort. Those interruptions result from vacancies in employees, just being short in terms of labor. They do not reflect an intentional programmatic or budgetary change. So if we're running short, say in the water division, it may take longer to repair a leak than it normally would. We'll prioritize emergency leaks and kind of probably abate ongoing maintenance and attend to those most urgent needs. But you may hear in the community from time to time that things didn't get done as quickly as they normally do. But that's not intentional. It's more a function of the labor market, which we hope this budget helps correct. Affordability, I think, has been a cornerstone of the various councils that I've had the good fortune and pleasure to work with. I think we pride ourselves on striking an effective balance between quality of life in Waynesboro and affordability, and I don't think that this budget does anything to disturb our position as an affordable community in which to live. Even recognizing that I'll note the need to make some recommendations concerning utility and enterprise rates subsequently. In terms of council's goals, I mentioned briefly above that we are able to implement the first phase of the pay study, and that quite simply moves folks who are outside of the new pay grade into the pay grade. Stated differently, it sets minimum pay at $13 per hour and it adopts a new pay grade system, and it moves those folks who then lie outside of that system into the system. There are 4 phases to the pay study. That initial phase is that moves folks in, and then the second phase moves folks to 10% of the market. The third phase is 5, and then the fourth phase is 2 markets. So I would say that this is progress, and welcome progress, given the public health and pandemic and economic challenges that the previous budgets presented. But there's still work to be done, and again, I want to strike an effective balance between acknowledging that this is, I think, very beneficial for those who are in the worst position in terms of market pay, but we still have a number of employees who are in a deficient position that don't enjoy benefit from this, which is part of the reason why we include a 3% merit opportunity that's extended to the entire organization. So if you're one of those folks who needs to be moved into a pay grade, you're going to get that benefit, and then you'll also get a merit opportunity. Folks who don't enjoy benefit from the pay study this year will only benefit from the merit opportunity. In terms of other goals from council, the CIP that we'll elaborate on subsequently fully funds Station 2, and we're making progress on that, so we would expect to continue progress in that regard. And we achieve, through the use of ARPA funds, full funding for Sunset Park. And we'll need to, it will be important to understand as we work through the budget and consider the CIP that once you confirm those programs, staff will be off and working. And I've highlighted the 2 programs that relate back to council goals. There are other elements in the CIP that we would expect to accomplish, but those are the 2 that relate to the council's goals. Enterprise funds, we recommend a 3% increase in water user fees, and that's to support the pay implementation and some inflationary factors in that fund, and it reduces reliance on fund balance. In previous years, I think the last increase in the water fund was 2019. When we get into these periods of stress, whether it relates to recession, inflation, or say a public health pandemic, we try to remain sensitive to affordability and the impact that utility rates have on customers. And what we end up doing is trying to, if a rate increase can't be avoided, we try to make it as modest as possible, and we try not to have rate increases across all 4 funds. And so you'll see a little bit of that in these recommendations. We do not have a rate increase recommended for the sewer fund. We have a rate increase recommended for refuse. Refuse collection goes up, we would suggest, $1.50 per month. And those revenues will be applied exclusively to capital investment at the landfill to deal with new cell development. It's not a function of our ability to collect and haul trash. It's more of a function of our need for capital investment at the disposal site. And then finally, we have a 3% increase in the stormwater fund. A little bit here. I mentioned quality of life, current service levels, and council's stated priorities and affordability. I hope that you're not surprised by any of those statements. And again, I would say that we do our level best to improve upon those things that we think make Waynesboro special and distinguish it. And we try to hold current service levels and balance that with affordability and make as much progress as we can on council's stated priorities. And that, I think we're all clear on that. Okay, Mr. McCormick.
Thank you, Mr. Hamp. So as Mr. Hamp alluded to, the net budget change for both revenues and expenditures is about $2.7 million. Our goal on this slide is to highlight some changes, the large changes and driving factors in the budget that were over about $100,000 singularly. And these changes cover about 2.2 of the $2.7 million increase. As with any budget, there's a number of revenue lines that increase some and decrease some, but these were the largest ones that were easy to kind of identify and pick out and talk about. One of the things that we also thought would be beneficial was to give some insight into how we come up with the estimates and then the total amount of these revenues by themselves and how they relate to the total $57 million budget. So the first line are your sales and meals tax, and the way we estimate that is we take the prior full 2 years collections and then the current year collections to date. And when I say to date, we were running those as recently as last week just to make sure we didn't get any data points that we looked at that we said these are starting to taper the other way. And so we extrapolate this year's through the end of the year and then average the 3 years. And then we went one step further this year and we checked it against what did we actually collect last year. And so total sales and total meals, the 3-year running average came out to almost exactly in both of those, within $50,000 or $100,000 either way, on about $11.6 million in revenue between those two. And so we look at that and we think the 3-year average combined with that's what you collected last year, that's a pretty good indicator of what you're likely to collect next year. Now I will say that is a aggressive number. I don't think it's unrealistic, but it's something that needs to continue to be monitored to make sure that we keep watching it to make sure there is no indication, because that can be one of the first things if the economy starts to slide, that number will start to slip back. So that is something that we'll continue to monitor to make sure that revenue estimate will hold. Total meals estimated at $5.35 million. Total sales at $6.3 million, which is about $11.7 million of your total $57 million budget. So about 20% of your revenue. The next one down is labeled as personal property, but could probably more accurately just be defined as that's really just the increase in motor vehicles. The motor vehicle increase was about $497,000. That is a reflection of the way that we estimate that tax is we look at the most recent ended fiscal year's tax book. So what we billed during this calendar year, so 2022 tax billings. Because generally the commissioner is working on the filing forms about this time. So we don't know what the market's going to do for next year. We don't know what business personal property is going to do for next year. So we kind of look at that a year in reverse. So that is a reflection of kind of what you're expected to collect this year is what we use as an estimate for the next year. And that generally works pretty well because we usually don't see big swings in those numbers. There's usually not a whole lot more business equipment, and motor vehicles usually don't appreciate. So usually what you see is you see some people buy some new cars, the motor vehicles appreciate a little bit, you end up with a little bit more revenue the next year, but it's a 5-10% swing one way or the other. What we're going to talk with you about, or what the commissioner is going to talk with you about, is what I think we would maybe consider an exceptional swing in motor vehicle rates. And so the other thing that's a little bit of a complicating factor in the personal property is you have about 3 major classes that depend or that are taxed on that $3.25 rate. So you've got your machinery and tools, your business personal property, and then your motor vehicles, motorcycles, things like that. Your motor vehicles and your motorcycles, the commissioner actually goes out and gets assessments for those vehicles, pulls them into her system, and we evaluate those assessments and line them up against the rate to come up with a taxable value. The business personal property and the machinery and tools are taxed based on how much they paid for the equipment and then a depreciable value after that. So what can end up happening is these things don't increase in step with each other. So if there is an inclination to do something to offset the assessments, If the business personal property doesn't appreciate at the same rate as the motor vehicle tax, the motor vehicle customers will still see an increase in their tax, and the business equipment will see a decrease in their tax. So that's just to say, as we start to work into what the commissioner has to say about what she's seeing in appreciation of vehicles, it's going to be, and how that combines with the Personal Property Tax Relief Act and how that combines with your motor vehicles. It's not just as simple as isolating the motor vehicles and making a correction there. It's going to be across an entire class of property. Next item is your real estate. That's a function of not an increased rate, but an increase in development around the city. That actually, your real estate tax estimate for this year is $18.9 million, and that's about 33% of your overall revenue. That calculates out to net tax of about $210,000 per penny, and it's important to remember that that is net tax. We do look at actual collections. We do look at, you have veterans and disabled relief that you have to give. You have elderly and disabled relief that you have to give. So that's net once you actually boil the taxable value down to what we collect. Street maintenance has crept up over $4 million. It's actually at $4,087,000. We estimate that by looking at what are our quarterly payments coming in this year, and historically that's not gone down, so we estimate whatever we're receiving this year for the next year, and that has to be spent directly on street maintenance. On the next expenditure slide, you'll see an offset to that number within about $13,000 of $175,000 to street maintenance expenditure to offset that number. So as Mr. Hamp alluded to, most of your increases are in compensation, benefits, and schools. They're your two single largest expenditure categories, so that's generally where you're going to see your most increase over your overall budget. Compensation and benefits is about $21.7 million of your total budget, and that's 38%. So most of that is going into the combination of the 3% raise, first phase of the compensation study, and all of that is, programmed for mid-year. It's important that we highlight that as mid-year for a couple of reasons. It pushes the impact of that on the employees back to mid-year, but it also means that you'll have to fully fund that in the next fiscal year. Health insurance, that's the prior year increase and the current year increase combined. Last year, we estimated about a 10% increase in health insurance, and that's about where it came out. This year, we're estimating that it'll be another 10% increase in health insurance, so that would wind up, at about $275,000. The emergency operations and fire increases, those are the increases that we gave that were the staggered increases in fire, the 432 increases, and then the 10% increases in the EOC. Since they weren't in the originally adopted budget last year, we have to reflect them here. VRS rate increase, that's an actuarial determined rate that we get from VRS that we're required to remit to them. And then the additional holidays that council approved in January of this year. Schools increase is $770,000. That is wholly based on the funding formula. Total commitment to the school this year is $17,428,000, and that's about 30% of your budget. That's based on the formula, which is 42.5% of our discretionary revenues based on the previous year's audit.
Could you repeat that last number again?
Which one? $17,428,000. Is that the one you were asking for?
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Again, the street maintenance number pops up. That's just to offset the revenue. We look at what we're spending in our allowable street maintenance codes. We line that up with the revenue that we're estimating that we're going to receive, and we balance those. And that'll go to offset some wage increases, and then a little bit into the paving program. And then finally, increased contribution to WAFAC. If you go to look for that in the budget document itself, that is actually in the city manager's contingency account. We moved it there just in case something happens something happens with meals or sales and it's not exactly right. It gives us a little bit of flexibility before we release those funds. That actually doubles your contribution to WayFact. So most years we give them about $70,000. That moves them to $140,000. That's a byproduct of the first aid crew going to transitioning more from a volunteer-based organization to a full-time based and salary-based organization. Their request was closer to $300,000, and that was too large of a lift for the current year. And there's also just some continued to make sure that they're being as efficient and effective as they can be, but that contribution, if they're going to continue to stay solvent, will probably continue to have to go up in the next few years.
I think, in my experience, councils are usually interested to hear and know about what is going on in terms of staffing and headcount. We do not have any new positions recommended in the general fund. In the Office on Youth Fund, we're combining 2 part-time positions, converting to a full-time position, and that's, I would like to acknowledge Jenny Newman. She's the director of the office, and she came to me and pointed out that recently there had been some pretty healthy conversations between the schools, the Office on Youth, the Boys and Girls Club, and some other youth-serving agencies in the community. We recognize, too, that families and young people are under stress, and that she felt like that dedicating some focused effort in Waynesboro would be, it's a good time, given the positions of those partner agencies, to do something a little different. So we worked to combine 2 part-time positions and a full-time position. That full-time position is not entirely dedicated to Waynesboro. We share costs with Stanton and Augusta County, but a portion of their time is funded exclusively by Waynesboro and will be dedicated to partnership building and program development, and hopefully improving the health of young people and families in our community. A reminder that we're holding 4 vacancies in the police department to fund increases that we're applying. And then we'd like to point out that the Commonwealth Attorney, this technically is in the general fund, but they have an additional position that came to them this year that's fully funded by the comp board. So there's no local money in that position, but it technically does increase the headcount in the general fund. We come to that recommendation not easily. We had a number of requests for new positions. All of these requests, in my view, are credible and legitimate requests in varying degrees, I would say. But I would like to draw attention to a couple. First being Ms. Jeffers requested a full-time assistant registrar. I think this is the 2nd year that she's made that request. And I would say that increasingly I'm persuaded and feel like that we'll have to give that request regular attention as we move forward, given opportunities for early voting, absentee voting, and increasing concern and effort around election security. So I want to draw that to your attention. The public information officer, that was something that I felt was important to try to include. We weren't able to do that. I would note that 2 of the 4 positions in Parks and Recreation are actually authorized positions that we froze during the pandemic public health emergency. And then you can see the other requests there as we work through the list. This would be a good time, I think, to at least offer an opportunity for a break. If we don't need one, we can push on. You've seen wraps. So we'll go. This should be a familiar diagram to you, and it's a little bit about, answers the question how we balance and then how we preserve affordability to some extent. And So each year, we adopt a budget that I would say is responsible and conservative in terms of its risk averse. We tend to not press a position that we don't think is justified where revenues are concerned, and we tend to manage expenditures judiciously. And in my experience, we always end up a fiscal year with a positive variance that falls to your fund balance. You might call that profit or net gain. But anyway, we have more money at the end of the fiscal year than we take in more money than we spend. So we have a positive variance that falls to your fund balance. Then, in order to balance in a given fiscal year, we go through the budget requests and comb out small capital replacement items. And these would include HVAC units in buildings, maybe carpet replacement. It oftentimes includes mowers, vehicles, just small capital items that we think, first of all, are legitimately qualify as capital expenditures. Computer equipment is another good example. And then we use fund balance to pay for those items and thereby alleviate the need to draw on recurring revenue or operating revenue to fund it. If there is any fund balance left after that exercise, we can divert some of it to your ongoing CIP. I would say that this is at the same time both genius and not a, what's the term, best practice. So it's a very practical way to preserve affordability and deal with budgetary needs. But I think best practice would be, and localities who can afford to implement best practice, not all localities can, would be to fund these items at least entirely or to the greatest extent possible out of your annual operating revenue. Then whatever fund balance is generated in a fiscal year can be diverted entirely to your CIP. So the process that we have, good stewardship, good management, good forecasting, both preserves our affordability position and helps fund your CIP, but we're clearly making choices between those two items.
Mike?
Yes.
And, not to hit you cold with this question, but I think, as we move forward, it would be helpful to understand if you were to quantify what is that annual reoccurring cost for, traditionally these small capital replacements, that would be sort of helpful. I think, not particularly maybe for this budget, but just looking ahead as we fully embrace the concept of a capital improvement plan and what that means, that would be helpful, because I think, in my time on council, it varies. I mean, from copiers to Parks and Rec pickup trucks, right? I mean, it's all over the map. So if we could some kind of quantify that, then that kind of, I think, would help all of us to understand what implications that would have for the operating budget.
Correct. So we can do that. I think Cameron's going to talk about that on the next slide for the current year, and then I know we've gone through that exercise in previous years to kind of make that illustration.
So we show you this slide more for awareness than it's firming up and close to a recommendation, but in order to implement these items, we'll have to bring a budget amendment probably in July or early August. So these aren't necessarily in front of you for your consideration today, but it's more for illustration of the type of things that we comb out of the operating budget to ensure that we can balance, and then there is still some funding left over to work towards your CIP plan. So your rollover, your total unassigned, and when I say total unassigned, I mean after all your assets less all your liabilities, and then you've got things that are restricted, things that are committed, and then management goes through and sees if there's anything that needs to be assigned to a specific project, like the fire station or a radio replacement or the radio tower project. The remaining after all of that happens during the current fiscal year was $1,376,000. The items here add up to about $844,000, and they range from replacement of PD vehicles that would cover about 3 police department vehicles, general vehicles that's your Parks and Recreation mowers, Parks and Recreation trucks. You have Rosenwald roof that is a little bit leaky right now, and some heat maintenance that needs to be done on the heating system there. The firehouse bunk room needs some work, and then some painting within the firehouse, and then a couple smaller items. The flooring needs to be repaired in the 911 center. And then while the flooring is being repaired, and the consoles are out, one of the consoles need to be replaced as well. And there's some general facility maintenance as well. So again, the total fund balance was about $1.3 million. Total here's 8.4. So that leaves you about $530,000 to go towards your CIP plan. So we joked a little bit this morning. This is kind of a truncated version of the CIP plan. If you'll flip to page, literally the very last page of your budget book, it's page 279. So we gave you a 279-page book, and we're going to talk about one page of the actual presentation. But when we tried to fit this on a slide, it just didn't work very well. So what's on the screen is kind of the top right. If you go up and you look at your, if everyone's there, if you go up and you look at the columns, it kind of starts with outlay and reserve, and then goes over to the comp plan reference and goes down to the total amount needed for capital projects. So the way this document works, and this is the capital investment program in its entirety for the current year. It's probably important to remember that this is just the allocation for the current year. So some of these projects we've been funding for multiple years, but this is just what's coming out of the current year, either from fund balance, from a grant, from the operating budget, or from basically any other source where you might get CIP funding. It's just a way to get all of the revenues into one place and make sure that we can cover the expenditures that are weighing on those revenues. So at the top, you have the department, and it identifies kind of who's responsible. That's more of a note for me, because that determines, based on that department, it basically says who has access to code expenditures to it in the system. So that piece is as much for me as it is for anybody else. The next column that's probably more important is the proposed funding source. So that breaks down whether it's local funding or grant funding. Next line is whether it's an outlay or it's a reserve. So that basically says, do we have the authority to spend that money during the current year, or is that money reserved and to turn it into an outlay? Do we need to inform council before? Project description is the next line. That just gives you a quick description of what the project that you're allocating costs for. The next one is the cost column, and again, that is just the 2023 piece of the budget. And then the last is the comprehensive plan reference. So now working down the columns, it's hopefully laid out so that the revenues, so if you go down maybe 3/4 of the way down the page where you see a bold line that says total amount needed, the first one's funds from 2023 budget. So those funds from 2023 budget add up to equal the Middle River Regional Jail debt payment and the Middle River Regional Jail reserve. So that is funded mostly by a payment that we receive from Rockingham County for their portion, Rockingham County and Harrisonburg, for their portion of the buy-in to the jail. The decision we made a few years back was, let's take that funding and set it off, pay the debt payment that's at the jail currently, and then set the difference off to the side so that we can continue to pay that debt payment once that payment from Rockingham and Harrisonburg is no longer coming. That will be close to fully funded once we're done. You will have to put some local funding with that, but it won't be near what it would have been every year had you not started setting up a reserve so you can pay the debt payment. And that debt falls off in 29 or 31, 29 or 30. The next item down is the West End Fire Station. We set aside about $947,000 for that last year. This takes you up to right at $2 million for that project. That's funded wholly by the assigned reserve for West End Fire Station from the general fund of $1,056,000, which if you go down, that's the next line below funds from 2023 budget. The next line is a fire truck replacement fund. That's there almost as much as a placeholder as it is for the dollars that are there. That to replace the fleet on the suggested schedule by the chief, that would cost about $250,000 a year. If you remember back the first year we did the CIP plan, the whole CIP plan basically went to replacing the current tower truck that's there. So the goal of this would be to build up a little bit of a reserve so that when you do have one of those large replacement items, you don't have to completely use all your CIP funds, because your rollover fund balance is usually $1.5 million. So if you have a fire truck pop up that you've not prepared for, the ladder was 1.4, I think a tanker is maybe 800 or so. So it can really deplete your ability to either divert that fund balance to small capital items or to fully fund a truck or a tower in a single year. Next item down is the regional radio system. That's the first allocation of that. That project is out for proposal now. That is a project between Augusta County, Stanton, and Waynesboro to get everyone onto the same radio system, and I think the total cost on that is about $1.7 million. So this will cover the first year of outlays for that project. That's funded by the assigned reserve that's right below the fire truck reserve. Next item is Sunset Park. This is probably the most complex funding, so I'll spend a little bit of time on how this one works. So $2,490,290 is an awfully specific number. There was a little over $9,000 left in the reserve that was set up a couple of years back. So if you add the reserve that's left to this 2.49, it comes up to 2.5 million exactly. So then the next component of that is Sunset Park budget amendment had gotten out of order. Assigned reserve for Sunset Park is $125,690. The reason that's there is we received a grant from VDOT for $350,000, a recreational access grant that's also reflected down in the grant section, that has a required local match with it. So we put the local dollars with that to make sure that we were in compliance with that grant. And then the remainder of the plug is the $2,014,600 of American Rescue Plan Act funds. That is about 10 items down. And that all those things aggregate up. If you take the prior year plus the local piece, plus the state funds, plus the ARPA funds, that gets you to the $2.5 million that it's projected to need for Sunset Park. South River Preserve, that is a fully federal project. I think it's through NERDA money. It's about $2.8 million in total, and I believe that's the last allocation, the $423,000. That should get it to the 2.8. I don't know if that project will be completely finished during this year or if it'll bleed into subsequent years, but the funding will be there as they need it to complete that project. Greenway Phase 4, that is another one that is a little bit complicated. So there's an assigned reserve for the Greenway Phase 4 of about $200,000, and then on top of that, the TAP grant that's $567,400. That's a little bit further down, goes with the Greenway reserve as well. And then we also received a VCLF grant to help offset the cost of some property acquisition if we need to acquire the property, of about $87,500. So you've got your local match requirements, your VDOT funding, which is, I believe that VDOT funding is actually federal flow-through funding, and your another VCLF grant that's all combined there. Ridgeview Park Pool ADA compliance and maintenance work. They're having some decking issues, a water line issue that's leaking some water, and then also would like to turn the I guess is that the child's pool or the kiddie pool? I don't know what the appropriate term for that is. To make that pool ADA compliant, it needs to be zero entry. For $250,000. The heating and air conditioning for the Gorsuch building, that's a reserve that we bolster every year as they work their way through the critical systems over there. I think there's a number of AC units over there, and we try to pick them off 5 or 6 a year instead of trying to do them all at once and it being a large expenditure or waiting for them to break. Rockfish Run stream restoration, that one's completely offset by a grant. That's the SLAF grant. East Main and Delphine roundabout. That is partially locally funded. It's a revenue sharing project, so it's 50-50. So half of that is in the VDOT revenue sharing, 126,000, and then the other half is funded by local funding. Various projects for the CDBG. We use the CIP fund for this because those projects span a number of years. So instead of having to come back and reappropriate those funds every year, if you appropriate it here, it's a multi-year fund. Council still has, I believe, some work to do on the next allocation of that will bring them the next fiscal year plan, bring you all next fiscal year plan, and you'll have to have a public hearing and approve that plan. But so that's why it's tagged as just various projects right now. But this will appropriate those funds. Southern Corridor, that is wholly local funded. It actually takes up most of the balance needed from local funding, which is the very last line in your revenue section. 390,462, that'll get it to, I think it was about $2.1 million in total was our share of that project. Museum of Natural History, that's from a assigned reserve in the general fund, and that is the estimated amount that we will need to pay to VDOT for the current year. And then finally I believe that's some environmental work for Waynesboro Commerce and Industrial Park to start to work that from a tier 3 to tier 2 or tier 4 to
Yeah,
tier
I think
3.
that's the early engineering and environmental assessment, just
Okay.
to see what the label means. But it's a valuable piece of property that I think with some work could become an element of our offerings to build economic development and industry and commerce in that area. We've been focused on the southern corridor, and this is a small step to activate that opportunity. That's the last one, Mr.
Yes, sir. So this will, if council approves this CIP plan, it'll come to you in two pieces. Part of it will be appropriated through just the regular budget process, the recurring pieces of it. So things like the grants will be appropriated through the recurring CIP projects, and the funds from the 2023 budget that are from the operating budget will be allocated during the budget process. The other items will come to you in a budget amendment, probably before the end of the current fiscal year. We can do that. The timing on that one's not as big of an issue. We don't have to wait till after the beginning of the fiscal year because it's a multi-year fund. So as soon as we appropriate those funds, transfer them to the general fund, it'll be freed up and stay freed up until the project that it's assigned for closes.
So Mr. McCormick referenced the use of ARPA funds. I think it makes sense to provide just an update, reminder of where we are with those funds. Your total allocation is $9 million. You have committed to two projects and actually spent premium pay benefit and then the raw water tank. So your spent or committed totals 3.3. That leaves you 5.7 remaining. The CIP, as it's currently configured, relies on $2 million of ARPA funds, which, if you adopted the CIP in its current form, would leave you about 3.7 ARPA funds available to work with in the second and third phase of programs or projects. Some general thoughts on the part of staff, and these are very preliminary. You might consider another economic development or enterprise fund project. I think the benefit of an enterprise fund project, it effectively buys down or staves off rate increases that might occur otherwise if you didn't enjoy the benefit of the ARPA funds. And then we have talked very generally about the opportunity to use ARPA funds for a second round of premium pay to bridge us from the last premium pay distribution to the implementation of the pay plan. And the initial thoughts are that you would have to been eligible for and received the first distribution, remain in the organization in a status that would make you eligible for the second, and it really becomes not exactly a part of your compensation study, but a bridge to kind of recognize the fact that we're not making as much progress on that this year as we might otherwise like. Enterprise funds. So I mentioned very generally that a 3% increase is recommended in the water fund, and we have a slide that will show the impact to a typical customer subsequently. That's to help implement the PANC classification study, to fight some inflationary forces in that fund and reduce reliance on fund balance. In those years that we might like to bring or recommend a rate increase but are not able, we sometimes rely on fund balance in the enterprise to balance and meet the needs in fund, much like we do for the general fund. We wouldn't use that to just fund operating expenses, but we might comb out equipment or specific project needs that could be funded with fund balance. No proposed increase in the sewer fund. A recommendation to increase the stormwater utility fee from $4.56 on the ERU to $4.70 per month. And then I also referenced the $1.50 per month proposed increase in monthly refuse collection rates. And Mr. McCormick, I think, is going to talk about, nope, I get the next slide. This illustrates the impact of the water and sewer. Well, there's no increase recommended in sewer, but the impact on the recommended rate increase in the water fund for a typical consumer using 10,000 gallons in a bi-monthly billing period. And you can see that that comes out to $2 a bill. We bill every other month, so the annual impact is $12.29. And again, because there's no increase in sewer, that's the impact entirely on the water and sewer consumption. Mr. McCormick is going to talk briefly about what's going on at the regional landfill, at least from a financial standpoint.
So the main driver of the cost at the regional landfill is its Phase 5 construction, and that's approximately $4,060,000 of construction between all three localities that are participants in the landfill. So the way that the city has generally been able to keep our refuse rates low is the landfills charges tipping fees. Those tipping fees partially go to cover a sinking fund so that when the landfill has to be capped and closed, everybody walks away from it and the cities don't have to continue to pay, city and county don't have to continue to pay funds into it. And then they partially go to funding the operations and the recurring costs at the Augusta County Service Authority or the landfill. Those costs have typically covered any cash flow needs that the landfill might have. As they go in and work into opening a new phase, that is going to come to an end probably during late 2022, if not early 2023. So the projected cash need from 2022, that actually comes from a pretty large piece of equipment that they had to purchase to continue operations there. And so as you work your way down, you've got your reserve funds of $600,000. So that comes from, there's $350,000 in the general fund that's been a reserve that's been set aside in the general fund for as long as I've been here, that's specifically to help offset this cost. And then there's about $250,000 in the refuse fund that we feel like you could put towards this project, which would get your initial cash to about $600,000. We did a rate increase during 2022 of $1.50 that came out to about $124,000, and checking the revenue estimates in that fund, looks like that estimate will hold and that reserve will be, that refuse fund contribution will be fully realized. And then if you subtract the projected cash need from this year, that gives you your surplus at the bottom of $554,000. So in the current year, you shouldn't need, in 2022, you shouldn't need to have to tap those two reserves. You should be able to just use what's in what we set aside from the rate increase this year. That number goes up to the reserve funds for the next year. And that's the pattern for every single year from 2023 all the way to 2027. The Phase 5 construction is projected for 2023, and it's $952,000. And so the rate increase for this time of $1.50 would take the ability to add to that refuse fund contribution from 124 to 244, so effectively doubles it. And it would still leave you with a deficit of about $154,000. Now, again, there are some funds in the refuse fund that can cover the cash outlay on that. That's not an exact estimate. Like us, they project their revenues and expenditures conservatively. But as you get into the next year, you start to see, okay, that number comes down and it turns positive. There's enough cash in that fund that amount of money is not going to put that fund to a point where it's in stress. As long as there are plans to continue to bolster the fund so that it can eventually pay for all of the costs at the landfill.
So typically what Cameron alluded to is that those capital needs tend to be equipment replacements or repair, or you might need a building or some small improvement on the site. But now we're up against sort of a once a decade, once every 22 decades, not 22, but every 2 decades, the need to build a new cell. And that's a pretty intensive capital investment that your cash flow really can't cover. And so that's why we're feeling stress in this regard and make the recommendation that we do. All right, we're headed down the home stretch here. So additional considerations. It's not of major significance, but it's interesting to note that the General Assembly adjourned without adopting a budget. I don't think this is a resource problem. I think this is a preference problem. So I would expect that they'll adopt a budget in the special session, and that probably will be more important to school systems than it is to localities, with the exception of what they do, if anything, with sales tax on grocery purchases. That has between $500,000 and $800,000 value to localities. And if the General Assembly modifies that program, eliminates the tax or reduces it, and doesn't hold localities harmless, that will be a big deal that we'll have to come back and figure out. And then we've referenced, probably to the point of beating a dead horse, ongoing work that we'll need to do around used motor vehicles and the personal property rate. So we can pause now, or this can be an assignment that the next steps would be to give staff and the city manager feedback on what you're hearing and what you're seeing. And that if we can confirm those elements where we're completely aligned and we're in good shape, that would be good. What are you liking about the budget? If we can identify areas that have misalignment, or areas that give you cause or cause concern or pause, where either you need more information for clarification, or as a body you need to deliberate and come to a consensus position, or work with staff to identify alternative means to accomplish a goal. That's the kind of feedback that we're looking for, and we can receive that formally along the way. If you have ideas today, we'd be happy to receive them. If we have ideas, and furnish those during regular meetings. I'm sure we'll be bumping into each other over the next several weeks. But the good thing is we have plenty of time to make improvement or repair as needed. April 5th is a planned work session. I'll note that we do not have a time set for that, so I would ask the council to consider that date and what your preference is for a starting time. And we'll need to dedicate some time for motor vehicles on that. And we'll go back and review the presentation and check notes, and we can generate probably an agenda where we think some more elaboration is warranted. But if you have things that you want us to focus on and prepare for, please share those, and we'll put that on the agenda. Then on the 12th, we have one scheduled, and then that'll be the point at which we need to commit to a rate, or in the rates generally, because on the 15th we advertise. So lots of time there to review and deliberate and consider, and hope the council recognizes that as an improvement to our operation. So I really appreciate your attention. I hope it was less formal, less preachy, if you will, and look forward to the next steps in the process. Yes, sir. So I think that's probably a larger conversation to have on several points. One is, my view is, in my experience, that the Sunset Park has been a long-standing goal for councils, even previous to this one. And that we have finally financial resource to push that project forward. I didn't hear the conversation specifically, or I heard portions of it. My thinking is that if the council has concerns about the opening a park there creates a public safety concern, then we should talk about that. And I certainly wouldn't recommend that you do that. To some extent, I have to think, though, that and I'd want to explore this with Mr. Wilhelm and Chief Shaw. When you say police the site or the facility, do you mean a level of service above and beyond that which we furnish Ridgeview or North Park currently? Do we think that because that park is on top of a mountain, adjacent to, sort of uniquely positioned, without boundaries against residential areas, so it kind of is a different proposition than, say, an urban park? How real is the concern about that? And do they think, in their professional opinion, that its unique geography and the fact that you then would be inviting and even encouraging people to go there, does that present a unique public safety need that cannot be met? And if that's their opinion, then I would say, yeah, we probably ought to think about this. On the other hand, though, if it's just somewhat peculiar and it would get the same treatment as Ridgeview, the cemetery, North Park, Basic Park, and that it's not really being actively policed, but it's being monitored, and that there is some measure of inherent risk there. And I would say, let's have a conversation with the manager and the council and say, what is our risk tolerance for that? And so I guess that's a long-winded answer to say that I'm not sure that I'm not sure that we're having the same conversation about can it be policed and will it be safe. And two, I'd say if we are having the same conversation, then let's be intentional about our decision to step away from the project.
Well, and to clarify, so I don't go from thinking I'm coming to see you. We're not see you. I do have a conversation. You see, that's behind you. We're not going to have a conversation.
Yeah, and there are a number of challenges that we got here, not just by
I think going forward, once again, I keep looking at it yesterday, and I wish we had an answer for how we'll get qualified candidates, and I think we're making good measures towards compensation and pay-time cost program and everything that we can do within our ability to try to do this. But in the meantime, when we've done short shift, we have multiple vehicles and abandoned vehicles and oversized vehicles parked throughout our city. But we don't seem to have time to police that right now. We want to add a whole new part of it, a place for them to be responsible. And we're going to start with four phases of Greenway, which is to do even more territory that wouldn't you feel safe, because what we have now, you've got people around you, you open, having people there with you on the Greenway. But when you open up that phase, it's a little different, it's not as well observed, and like we will protection on there, cold, gossip, back out, whatever. And then we're supposed to be doing something on down the basic part. You can have a lot more people just in those areas that we don't have a lot of people and vehicles sitting and using our parks now. And I have a really concern for us trying, to talk about parks and rec, to keep keeping up until it's better. Do the job, we have to sub out some of the mowing issues, so we can pick up even more. But we don't have anything to do. And I just have a really hard time looking at the constituents in this town and telling them, yeah, you'll be safe. Because I don't feel like it can happen.
I would like to respond to that a little bit. Certainly, I echo Mr. Wilhelm's comments about that has to be part of the conversation. But at the same time, here we are, we have an opportunity. And as has been pointed out, many councils have looked at that opportunity and said, we should make that happen. We should make that happen. And to present it as solely a policing issue, I think is really, putting the wrong scope on what we're talking about here. This is the potential for a long-term, enormous benefit to the quality of life here in Waynesboro. And the idea of the mountain bike, trails and the recreational opportunities, yes, we have to think about what that means, not only for policing, but also for safety, for access, in terms of being able to help folks up there if something happens. But to present it as we need to make our decision based solely on the policing, I think really puts the wrong part of the conversation in the front. Is it a part of the conversation we need to have? Yes, I agree entirely. But let's present it as an opportunity and see how to make that opportunity happen rather than a burden that we want to avoid. Would be my take.
I might just want to.
I agree with what you said, but I'm going to rely on their emergency service people and their police department to to see whether or not we need to go forward with something that they give us the green light, yes, if we can handle and we can protect. And I'm not saying, it's not a slam to the police department. It's what we have and what we're going to be capable of doing. And, you know, I'd hate to see it build it, and then we have so many problems up there, we start having drug activity over there, because it's an out-of-the-way place, accessible from the other side of the park where people be parking out, where it's not very well controlled, and walking up through the woods to get up there. And then we have to lock it up and shut it down because we can't take care of it. I'm a supporter of Sunset Park. I think it's one of the prettiest places we have in the city and has great potential. But I'm going to put safety first on anything.
Yeah, I'd just like to interject that I think it's important that we not treat this subject, particularly for our friends at the News Virginian who are attending today, that and those that are watching, that to understand and appreciate that these are not mutually exclusive, right? So I mean, you have a long history of arguably this council and past councils who led to the conditions at the police department. And so I would pivot to this conversation, right? Because these topics are not in isolation. And I would ask Mr. Ham, Mr. Wilhelm, do you think that the additional holidays that we've offered, the mid-year pay adjustment, the premium pay, the implementation of the comprehensive pay schedule, the take-home vehicles, and the hierarchy changes that we've made at the police department, will that improve retention and attraction of police officers to our department?
I could do it first. I think no doubt they will, yes.
Okay.
And I think, in fact, I would be so bold to say that the recent work that this council has done has really, now it's unfortunate because it's taken place in the context where we have neighboring jurisdictions who have been just ridiculously aggressive.
Right.
But we're kind of leading the way in our little section of the valley right now. And so I think, yes, the short answer to your question is yes, absolutely.
So we've made over the last 12 months and looking ahead to the next 12, we've made and are continuing to make significant improvements in retention and attracting and cultivating our police force to what they deserve and what our community deserves. And so, because, you know, not to go on the negative slant, but I mean, if we operate in isolation of where we are at the present moment, then we should be frozen in indecision. We shouldn't advance any other project, whether it's a Greenway, whether it's an industrial park or otherwise, because you're essentially expanding the territory of our city that expands the need for additional resources, which obviously I don't think anyone on council would support being frozen in indecision. Instead, I think we rely on our professional staff and our police and our EOC representatives to come forward, share these are the circumstances, these are the resources, these are the investments that need to be made. And council, I'm very proud of this council and past councils of beginning to turn the tide and to make those improvements. Because if we are frozen in indecision, we will never move our community forward. We will stay stagnant and we will not remain competitive. And that is the thing that I'd go back to our comprehensive plan and that conversation about what does an investment mean. We are competing with our neighbors. If we want to remain competitive, we have to remain aggressive and diversifying the things that make us unique and capitalizing on the assets that we already have. And so with that said, I'm excited about the investment. I'm really excited the fact that we're able to fulfill and potentially move forward with that investment without a direct implication to our local tax base and our local taxpayers, because again, it's being used with the American Recovery Act funds. So,
Well, I think part of the security too is not only police fire up there, but we live in a society now where we can put security cameras, we can put monitoring stations up there and watch the overall open areas. Now all the bike trails, probably not, but that's any park. You look at the parkway up there, all the trails that splinter off the national parkway, they're not patrolled by police, fire, or rescue, they're patrolled by citizens that are using them. It's just it's a park, and there's always going to be an aspect of privacy up there when you're up there working. But we also have the open areas we can monitor the cameras, and the police department can monitor those, the EOC can monitor those. I think we can.
We
And the only other thing that I would ask is, you know, we're state police thing right now, as far as business. I know one time they were at a
Well, every law enforcement in the nation are down.
But I mean, you know, if we were fully staffed, we'd be having this conversation. But I'm just concerned with the rate of crime, you know, the lack of people wanting to get into law enforcement, or the ones that got in and got out because of people there. That's what I'm signed up for. And when we started, you know, having the shooting work, I think that we should put more pressure on
But then-
it's horrible, but,
We can't base our life on fear like
well,
that.
no, but, I still going, I'm going to refer to
And I think that's a good thing to do, is refer to staff and sit down and have conversations about how we can make this work. And-
Obviously, it's a very passionate issue, and I think all of us would agree that Sunset Park would make a great addition to Waynesboro. I agree with that, and Mr. Short said that he felt the ARPA funds will make this become a realization. I, on the other hand, I'm going a little bit different route and say that I don't feel that the ARPA funds is a great use to be used on a park. I feel like that's the wrong use for those funds. And I just want to go on record with that. I like the idea of the park. I would like to find a different way to fund it, provided we could have the security needed there. But I do have concerns about using the ARPA funding for that project.
I think one thing we can do is, clarify terms and respond to your question about public safety, about, well, what level of service can we deliver in the current staffing configuration? So I think that's a good point, Mr. Allen, that consumers or patrons of the park, if and when we ever have it constructed, ought to have some idea of the measure of service they're going to get in that regard. And then I think, too, would be helpful to identify or have Mr. Wilhelm articulate the various public safety concerns that he used when he looks at the park, not just those related to law enforcement. So I think that's a good question, and I think, too, we can project, well, if we ever return to, or when we return to full staffing, what does that level of service? And then the council can respond to whether, in your judgment, that's adequate or not, or what measure of risk is associated with that, and if it's an acceptable measure of risk. So I think you raised some good points, and we probably don't have, like other issues, we probably could benefit from a clarifying of definition and expectation.
Well, and I would also offer too that, I mean, we can't, I would argue that I don't think that any of us could be in a position where we would say, you know, we've got a real issue to address at our police department and our emergency services, and then not also fund the 4 positions that are going to remain funded in the upcoming budget for the police department, or 6 positions in the fire department. So if we want to have that conversation, then let's have that conversation, because you can't say we need to do more and then pull back on position development and recruitment. You know, there's an absolute contradiction and tension between that. So I would just offer that as a reflection point of, if we wanted to go down that route, well, then perhaps we should revisit the conversation about the positions that the city manager is not recommended for inclusion in the budget. You can't say one thing and then do another.
I'd like to build the ones that we have, not talking about them.
Well, these are the 4 that are already approved that we're going to retain, that we're going to, right, Mike? I mean,
That's correct. So we're holding those.
We're
and that's
holding
with the
positions.
notion that, as a practical consideration, I think there remain between 8 and 12 other vacancies that we will hopefully fill in the fiscal year. But we don't have enough to staff to kind of field and train and recruit 16 in a year. I don't know what the max is, but I'm sure we can't do 16. So we feel like, we don't like the signal that it sends, that some people might think, well, you don't need those positions because you're holding them vacant.
Well,
On the other hand,
why I
we're
said it.
prioritizing the resources that otherwise would be underutilized.
We only have 10 you wouldn't do something like that. Right?
Yes, sir. That's all we have prepared.
Is that good with everybody? I appreciate everybody's candor and participation in this meeting today. It was great. And Mike, staff, thank you guys very much for presenting this and for the homework you gave us. So.
Yes, sir.
Well,
All
like
right.
reading to me.
Well, then we'll close the meeting for today.